The rain fell steady on the desolate station, pattering soft against warped wooden planks and the rusting rails that stretched into nowhere. At the far end of the platform stood a woman in a faded white wedding dress, soaked to the hem, clinging to her body like a second skin. A suitcase sat at her feet, warped and splitting at the seams. One hand cradled her belly, round and unmistakably heavy with child, while the other gripped the wrought iron post of the station's awning as if it were the last solid thing in the world. Henry Callahan saw her from the shadowed interior of the depot, just as he was about to head back to his wagon. He paused. Not because of the dress or the suitcase, but because of her stillness. There was something in the way she stood that struck him. Not just abandoned, stripped. Like the world had taken too many things from her too fast, and she was still trying to stand up straight under the weight. He adjusted his coat, wet from his ride in, and stepped onto the platform. Boots thudded against the boards. She didn't look up. "Train's been gone near an hour," he said. Her eyes, sharp, dark, tired, met his. "I know." Henry gave a nod, the kind men gave when words didn't help. He looked down at her bag. "You waiting for someone?" "I was." Pause. Then, quieter, "Guess I was the fool in that arrangement." The wind picked up. She shivered, and her free hand tugged the soaked fabric of her dress tighter over her shoulders. Henry looked down the track, then back at her. The silence between them had weight. He wasn't a man who inserted himself in other folks' troubles. Not anymore. Not since Margaret died. But something about the woman's voice made it hard to walk away. "You got a name?" "Calamity Jane." She lifted her chin. "And I'm not a street girl if that's what you're thinking. I came to marry a man. He just didn't come to marry me." Henry let the rain fill the space between them for a moment. She was proud, he could tell. Proud and exhausted. He tilted his hat back. "I'm Henry Callahan. Got a place 10 miles out. 2 boys. A leaky roof. And a spare bunkhouse if you need a place to dry out for the night." Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" He shrugged. "Reckon I'd want someone to do the same for my sister. If I had one." She didn't smile, but she didn't say no either. He turned and began walking. After a long pause, he heard her lift the suitcase. The soft thump of her boots followed his. By the time they reached his wagon, the rain had turned needle-sharp and cold. Henry helped her up. Her hand in his was trembling, not from fear but from bone-deep weariness. She winced as she settled on the seat. "Baby kickin'?" he asked. "Like he's mad the world don't match the letter I wrote about it." Henry gave a breath of something like a laugh. She looked surprised by it, maybe even a little reassured. They rode in silence for a while, the wet wind cutting around their coats. The horses' hooves were the only sound, steady and sure on the muddy trail. Henry kept glancing sideways at her, at the way she clenched her jaw, the way she kept one hand over her belly like a shield. "You got any kin back east?" he asked eventually. "No," she said. Then added, "Not the kind that'd take me in." "Man who left you, he from out there?" Her lips thinned. "No. Out here. Settler type. Said he needed a bride who could give him an heir. Thought I was perfect. Then he saw the bump." "He didn't know you were expecting?" "He didn't ask." Her voice was sharp but not angry. Just hollow. "Guess he thought mail order meant perfect." Henry didn't say much after that. The rest of the ride passed in quiet, broken only by the occasional grunt of a horse or the low creak of the wagon wheels. The ranch came into view under a veil of fog. 3 buildings, main house, barn, bunkhouse, stood like worn teeth in a crooked smile. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Henry helped her down, suitcase and all, and guided her toward the bunkhouse. "Ain't fancy. Got a stove, dry blankets. If it leaks, holler." Calamity Jane nodded. "Thank you." He paused at the door. "You can lock it from the inside." She gave him a look that wasn't gratitude so much as recognition, of a kind of dignity that people like them had to hold on to tight. He tipped his hat and left her there. Back in the main house, Henry dried off, lit a lamp and checked on his boys, already asleep under patchwork quilts. Then he sat in the kitchen with a tin of coffee, staring out at the bunkhouse window, faintly lit. He thought of his wife. Of how death took her in childbirth and left him with 2 boys and a silence that had never really left the house since. He thought of Calamity Jane standing alone on that platform. And how close he'd come to walking past her. The wind rattled the shutters. Outside the storm thickened. Sometime past midnight, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Calamity Jane standing there, blanket around her shoulders, eyes wet from more than rain. She started, then stopped. Her voice was tight. "I woke up. Dreamt I was still on that platform. Still waiting. And no one ever came." Henry nodded. You want to sit? She hesitated, then stepped in. Sat at the edge of the table. The warmth of the stove painted her face in gold. I wrote 30 letters, she said quietly. All honest. Told him I wasn't a virgin. That I'd been hurt. That I was expecting. I figured if someone still wanted me after that, I could build a life. You were brave, Henry said. She shook her head. I was stupid. He wrote back once. Said he believed in second chances. Then he never showed. Henry leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. That ain't stupid. That's just hoping out loud. Calamity Jane looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly, like she was trying to decide whether or not to believe him. He poured her some coffee. She took it with both hands, letting the heat soothe her. My wife died having our second, he said after a long silence. I didn't get to say goodbye. Been chasing the quiet since. Did you love her? I did. Still do some days. But that ain't stopped time from moving forward. She nodded. Something in her softened. Then she said the thing that cracked the night wide open. The man who hurt me, he's someone with money. Power. His folks paid me to disappear. I took the money and ran. Got halfway to a new life before the shame caught up. Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I don't want his name on this child. I don't want pity. I just want to matter again. I want to be someone's beginning, not always someone's mistake. Outside, a gust of wind slammed against the house, but inside, the silence was warmer. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. If you want, you can stay. Long as you need. Ain't much, but it's honest. She looked at him again, and this time, something flickered across her face, like a match being struck in a dark room. I ain't looking for charity, she said. And I ain't offering it. She set down her cup. Then I reckon we have an understanding. Henry stood too. Reckon we do. As he walked her to the door, she paused and turned. I didn't thank you for stopping at the station. You didn't need to. Her voice dropped low. I think I did. Then she walked back to the bunkhouse into the rain, but with a steadier step. Henry watched her disappear through the night mist. The lantern light flickered behind her like a promise barely formed. And somewhere in his chest, a part of him he thought long dead stirred, just a little. He didn't know it yet. But the storm had already started to change them both. Morning came slow, with a frost-tinged light that turned the field silver. Smoke curled from the bunkhouse chimney. Henry had already been up an hour, feeding the animals, checking the fence posts. He worked with the quiet focus of a man used to solitude, but today something tugged at his attention. A small warmth lodged behind his ribs, stubborn and unexpected. He looked toward the bunkhouse just as the door creaked open. Calamity Jane stepped out, wrapped in a heavy shawl, the hem of her dress still damp from being hung to dry overnight. Her belly pressed gently against the fabric, and she moved with the caution of someone carrying more than just weight, like each step had to be earned. Mornin'? He called from the barn. She nodded but didn't smile. Her eyes swept across the yard, taking in the chicken coop, the lean-to, the broken windmill that hadn't spun properly in years. It's quiet. Usually is. She took a few steps toward him, one hand resting on her back. You weren't lying. This place is honest. Worn but honest. He didn't know how to answer that, so he simply said, Come on inside. Coffee's ready. She hesitated. Then, with a breath, followed him toward the main house. Inside, the warmth of the stove embraced them both. The scent of wood smoke and boiled oats lingered. 2 boys sat at the table. James, the older one, and little Thomas, whose legs still dangled from the bench. James looked up first. That her? Henry nodded. Boys, this is Miss Calamity Jane. She's staying for a while. Calamity Jane gave them a soft, measured smile. Pleasure. Thomas blinked. You got a baby in there? Thomas? James hissed, elbowing him. It's all right, Calamity Jane said, her voice calm. She knelt slowly until she was eye level with the boy. I do. She kicks when folks are kind. Thomas grinned, charmed. James stayed guarded, but his eyes tracked her with something close to curiosity. Henry poured her a cup and slid it across the table. She took it with quiet gratitude. I can help, she said after the first sip. With chores. I don't expect to be fed for free. Henry raised an eyebrow. You ever slop pigs? I've survived worse, she said, and for the first time since he'd met her, her voice had a little iron in it. They ate in companionable quiet. Then, after breakfast, Calamity Jane rolled up her sleeves, literally, and followed Henry to the pens. Chickens scattered at her approach. A goat headbutted her hip. She didn't flinch. She laughed. You let these animals run wild on purpose? I prefer to think of it as character building, Henry said dryly. By noon, they'd fixed a loose fence board, collected a dozen eggs, and shared a moment of startled eye contact when a hawk swooped low overhead. The air was cold but clean. Calamity Jane's cheeks were pink with effort. She looked almost free. They sat on the porch later, drinking from mismatched tin mugs, watching the sun drift across the field. Calamity Jane glanced toward the barn, where the boys were tossing pebbles into a pail. They're good boys. They are. Henry's voice softened. Lost their ma 2 years back. James remembers too much. Thomas remembers too little. I never had any, she said. This one'll be my first. And maybe my only. Henry turned to her. Do you know what you'll name her? I thought about Hope. But maybe that's too much to ask of one child. He looked out at the fence line. Maybe not. Sometimes one name is all it takes to hold things together. She studied him. What about Shelter? That'd be a name worth living up to. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full. Heavy with unspoken things. Then she stood, dusted off her skirt. I'd like to make dinner if I can. I noticed you boiled the beans yesterday until they tasted like regret. He huffed. Didn't hear you complaining. I was too cold to argue. That evening, the house smelled of stew and cornbread. Calamity Jane moved through the kitchen like she'd always belonged there. The boys hovered nearby, fascinated by her stories, how she once rode a ferry during a storm, how she watched fireflies dance in a Georgia orchard as a child. Even Henry found himself lingering longer than usual. But the peace didn't last. The knock came just after sunset. Henry opened the door to find Reverend Wills standing on the porch, hat in hand, eyes sharp behind round spectacles. Evenin', Henry. Reverend. The older man cleared his throat. Heard there was a woman stayin' here? A mail-order bride left at the depot? Henry stepped aside slightly, blocking the view. She's here. She's safe. That's what matters. Wills tilted his head. Safe, yes. But respectable? Folks are talkin'. A pregnant woman livin' under your roof, unmarried, it casts a shadow. Henry's jaw tensed. She's done nothing wrong. It's not always about what's wrong. It's about what folks believe is right. Before Henry could answer, Calamity Jane appeared behind him. It's all right, Henry. She stepped forward, standing straight, unflinching. I appreciate your concern, Reverend. But I'm not ashamed. I came here for a husband. The man I chose turned out to be a coward. I'll not hide because of his choices. Wills blinked, thrown off by her composure. See. Well, I'll pray for clarity. Pray for him instead, she said, then gently closed the door. The boys were quiet at the table. Henry turned back to Calamity Jane, something unreadable in his eyes. That was brave, he said. I'm tired of being quiet. That night, Henry found himself awake longer than usual. He stepped onto the porch and found Calamity Jane already there, sitting with her hands over her belly, watching the stars emerge between passing clouds. He sat beside her. Preachers write about one thing, she said softly. This ain't easy. I've slept in fields, run from things I never should have faced alone. But for the first time in a long while, I don't feel like I'm hiding. Henry nodded. You're not. She turned to him. And you? You been hiding? He thought about it. About the years spent half alive, going through motions because that's what the boys needed. Yeah, he said. Maybe I have. Calamity Jane studied him. Why did you stop for me? At the station. I don't rightly know. Just, didn't feel right to leave you there. She smiled, and it was a small wounded thing. You could have ridden on. Could have. But I'd still be wondering why I didn't stop. The wind was soft against the porch rails. The stars burned quietly above them. I don't expect you to carry me, she said. I ain't trying to. But I can walk beside you. She looked at him, then really looked, like she was weighing every word he'd said since the day they met. And slowly she nodded. Maybe that's enough. Just then the boys' laughter broke through the window. Calamity Jane tilted her head. They're good at that, finding joy in small places. Henry stood. So are you. She didn't answer. Just watched him go inside. She lingered on the porch a moment longer, her hand resting on her belly. Inside that house, in a name that hadn't yet been spoken aloud, in a place she hadn't expected to end up, she'd found something she'd thought was lost. Not salvation. Not safety. But the beginning of shelter. And as she turned in for the night, her heart beat steady with the quiet question neither of them had dared to speak yet. Could two broken people make something whole? Not yet. But maybe soon. The day the trouble arrived, the sky was too clear. Not a cloud in sight, not a hint of warning in the wind. Just the dry hum of cicadas, the screech of a distant hawk, and boots, polished and deliberate, striking dust from the road with every step. Calamity Jane saw the stranger first through the kitchen window, a tall silhouette cutting up the dirt trail toward the house. His coat was dark, fine-cut, too clean for this land. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but even at a distance, there was something too smooth, too certain, about the way he carried himself. She stepped out onto the porch, one hand resting on the rail, the other over her belly. The man stopped at the gate, took his hat off with a theatrical sweep, and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that tried to own the space it occupied. "Calamity Jane," he said. "Didn't expect to find you living in domestic charm." She stiffened. "Silas." Henry emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, and took in the scene in one long look. He saw the way Calamity Jane's spine had gone rigid. The way the man leaned on the gate like he owned the land. "You know this man?" Henry asked quietly, approaching the porch. Silas didn't wait for her to answer. "Silas Croft Jr. My father runs the rail company you're so fortunate to have out this way. Calamity Jane and I had a history." Henry's jaw tightened. "That right?" Calamity Jane stepped forward. "What do you want?" Silas chuckled and ran a gloved hand along the fence post. "You vanished, sweetheart. My father wasn't pleased. We just arranged your exit. Modest payment, discretion. And then I hear rumor of you showing up out west. Wearing a wedding dress. Pregnant." Henry's voice was flat. "You the father?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "She never proved it. Could be anyone's. But it's a question, isn't it? One that respectable folks around here might start asking." Calamity Jane's knuckles turned white against the rail. "I told you I didn't want your name on her. You don't have to want it. It's mine all the same." Henry stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet from Silas, eyes hard. "She's under my roof now. That's the story." Silas looked around. "Nice patch of dirt. Shame if rumors ruined your standing. Especially with a preacher already asking questions." Henry's voice dropped low. "You threatening me?" Silas held up both hands. "Just observing. A man's reputation is a fragile thing in towns like these." There was a long silence. Dust blew through the yard. The creak of a shutter sounded like a scream. Then Calamity Jane said, cold and clear, "You didn't come all this way for conversation. Say what you came to say." Silas gave her a slow, calculating smile. "I came to offer you a second chance. Quiet money. Safe travel. A clinic in Denver. They'll take care of you. My father's already arranged it." "I'm not for sale," she said. "You were once." Henry's fist landed before anyone saw it coming. Silas staggered back, blood blooming from his lip. The birds in the cottonwoods scattered with a roar of wings. Henry stood over him, shoulders squared, eyes like stone. "You leave?" Henry said. "No. You so much as look this way again and you won't be walking back." Silas straightened slowly, wiped the blood from his mouth, and laughed. "I'll be back, Mr. Callahan. This isn't over. You're harboring a problem the law might get interested in." He tipped his hat to Calamity Jane, mocking, and strode back down the road, boots kicking dust behind him like a retreating storm. Inside the house, the boys had gone quiet. James stood in the hallway, eyes wide, watching his father's hands shake. Calamity Jane walked to the sink, poured water into a bowl, and brought it to the table with a clean cloth. Henry sat, bruised knuckles outstretched. She cleaned the blood with quiet, deliberate motions. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I did. You could get in trouble." He looked up at her. "So could you." The cloth paused. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She sat across from him, the space between them full of everything that hadn't been said since that man appeared. "Do you believe me?" she asked. "I do. Even if it gets messy?" "Especially then." That night, Calamity Jane didn't sleep. She sat in the bunkhouse with a kerosene lamp burning low, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Her hand moved over her belly in slow, gentle circles. The child kicked once, strong and sure. She whispered, "You're not his." In the main house, Henry lay awake too. He stared at the ceiling, the memory of that man's smug face burning into his thoughts. He'd seen men like Silas before, men who thought wealth covered sin like paint on rot. He rose, dressed in silence, and stepped out into the dark. On the porch, Calamity Jane was waiting. "I couldn't stay in there," she said. He nodded. "Me neither." They sat beside each other on the bench, saying nothing at first. The moonlight made ghosts of them both, tired, touched by something they hadn't chosen. Finally she said, "He'll come back. With worse." "I know. He could ruin you." Henry looked at her. "Let him try." She exhaled, sharp and shaky. "I keep thinking I should go. Run again. That it's safer." He turned to her, voice steady. "I didn't take you in to watch you leave. If you run, he wins. And I lose something I didn't know I was looking for." She blinked. "What's that?" "A reason." The silence after that was warm, full of the quiet kind of bravery that doesn't need speeches. Then Calamity Jane said, "If I stay, would you marry me?" He didn't flinch. "Not out of pity," she added quickly. "Not because it's the right thing or the kind thing. But because this world don't give women like me many chances. And if you give me your name, it might be enough to keep him away." He looked out at the horizon where the first edge of morning threatened the stars. Then back at her. "I'll marry you," he said. "Not because you need saving. But because I'd rather stand beside you than live without you." She nodded once, slow and full of the weight she carried. And when the sun finally rose, it found them still there, two people on a porch choosing each other in a world that never asked their permission. And far down the road, where no one could yet see, another set of boots struck dust, and this time they weren't alone. Dawn broke like a blade, sharp, gold, and merciless. The ranch lay quiet, save for the low rustle of wind through the cottonwoods and the restless shuffle of horses in the barn. But Henry Callahan was already dressed, boots laced tight, rifle oiled and loaded. He stood at the porch rail, scanning the tree line where fog clung low to the earth like breath on cold glass. He didn't wake Calamity Jane. He couldn't. Inside the house, she slept curled on her side, one hand over her belly, the wedding band he'd slipped onto her finger just days earlier catching what little morning light filtered through the curtain. She looked peaceful. Or maybe just determined to appear that way. But Henry knew better. She'd barely eaten since the preacher married them. Barely rested. The tension lived in her shoulders, in the way her eyes kept drifting to the road even when there was nothing there. Because they both knew he was coming. And this time he wouldn't come alone. Henry took his place beside the barn, hidden in shadow, eyes locked on the rising ridge. The sheriff had ridden out the day before, called east on railroad business. No backup coming. Just Henry, two boys still too young to hold a rifle, and the woman who'd risked everything for the right to stay. The shot came just after sunrise. A single crack of gunpowder splitting the air. It echoed off the hills, sharp enough to make the horses rear. Henry ducked low, instincts honed by years of quiet vigilance. Another shot followed, closer this time. He saw them now. 3 men on horseback, rifles slung, dust trailing behind them like smoke. And behind them, in a black overcoat, rode Silas Croft. He wasn't smiling now. Henry stepped out from the barn, rifle raised. "Turn around," he called. Silas pulled his horse to a stop, hand resting on the pommel. "You won't shoot me, Callahan. You've got too much to lose." Henry didn't blink. "I've already lost enough." One of the hired guns nudged his horse forward, cocky. "There's 4 of us, old man." "That right." Henry fired. One shot, clean, striking the man's shoulder. He dropped from the saddle with a cry, rifle clattering against the dirt. The others scattered briefly, surprised by the speed of it. Silas held up a hand. "Enough. Stand down." He dismounted slowly, eyes locked on Henry. "I came for the girl," he said. "You can keep your pride. Just give her to me and we'll leave you breathing." Henry stepped closer. "You come onto my land with threats and men and bullets and you think this ends in mercy?" Silas's voice dropped. "She's carrying my air. My father wants her under his roof." "She's carrying hope," Henry growled. "And she's under mine now." Behind them the door creaked open. Calamity Jane stepped out barefoot, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, rifle in hand. Her face was pale but her eyes were steady. "She's not yours," she said. Silas turned, startled. "You shouldn't be out here. I shouldn't be breathing either if you had your way." She walked past Henry and stood beside him. "But I am. And I won't be dragged back into your lies." One of the other men raised his rifle. Henry caught the motion and fired again, this time grazing the man's arm and sending him behind his horse for cover. Gunfire broke loose. The yard turned into chaos, dust kicking, bullets singing through air, wood splintering near the porch. Henry pulled Calamity Jane behind the water trough. "Stay down," he hissed. "I can fight." "I know. But not like this." She nodded once and ducked low. A bullet nicked the edge of the barn. Another slammed into the fence post just inches from where Henry had been standing seconds before. He moved with grim precision, dropping to one knee, leveling the rifle. He fired twice. One of the hired guns screamed and fled into the brush. The last man hesitated, then turned tail, galloping back the way they'd come. That left Silas. And Silas wasn't running. He stood in the center of the yard, pistol drawn, hat gone, dust caking his boots. Rage twisted his features. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You've got a broken house, 2 brats, and a ruined woman. That's your prize." Henry stepped forward, rifle lowered now, voice calm. "I've got something you'll never have, Silas." "And what's that?" "A name someone can trust." Silas roared and lifted his gun. Calamity Jane fired. The blast echoed like thunder, loud and final. Silas staggered back, hands pressed to his chest. He looked at her, eyes wide, almost childlike. And then he dropped to his knees, breath rattling. Dust curled around him as he collapsed. The silence after was complete. Even the wind held its breath. Calamity Jane stood frozen, the rifle trembling in her hands. Henry caught her as her legs gave out, lowering her gently to the ground. "I'm all right," she whispered. "I had to. I know I did." He brushed the hair from her face. "You did." The boys came running, eyes wide with fear. Henry pulled them close. "It's over," he said. The sun crested fully now, pouring light over the ranch like a blessing. The smell of gunpowder lingered, but the air felt different, cleaner, lighter. Later they buried Silas near the back ridge, no marker, no prayer. Just dust to dust. The sheriff returned by noon, took one look at the scene and the evidence, and left without asking much. That night Henry built a fire. Calamity Jane sat close beside him, her hand resting over his. The boys dozed on the porch swing, heads leaning against one another. They didn't speak for a long while. Then she said, "She kicked. Just before I pulled the trigger." He looked at her. "She knew," Calamity Jane murmured. "She knew I had to protect her." Henry kissed the back of her hand. "You did more than that. You gave her a future." She turned to him, eyes glassy but strong. "So did you." They sat until the stars came out, the wind warm now, soft against their skin. And in the hush between the fire crackles, Henry spoke again. "We'll name her Hope. Not because we expect things to be easy, but because she'll remind us what's worth fighting for." Calamity Jane smiled, weary and full of grace. "Then she'll carry more than a name. She'll carry everything we almost lost." And just like that, the story of 2 broken people became the beginning of something whole. The shot heard at sunrise wasn't just an end. It was a beginning.
The snow had fallen so long it had forgotten how to stop. Bellstar trudged through knee-deep drifts, one gloved hand pressed against the swell of her stomach, the other clutching a satchel that held all she had left. 3 buttermilk biscuits wrapped in cloth, a water flask gone slushy, and her mama's journal with the pages worn thin from prayers whispered between the lines. Her boots were cracked. Her breath steamed into the white void like smoke from a dying fire. Each step forward cost her more than she could afford, but turning back wasn't an option. Behind her lay the town of Bell Rock, where shame walked louder than boots and the truth didn't stand a chance against a whispered lie. She hadn't slept in 2 days, not since Harold Graves, who'd once sworn he'd marry her come April and cradle her child as if it were his own, had recoiled like she'd turned to ash in front of him. He hadn't even let her speak. Just wave her off like a cursed thing and spat into the snow. "You lied," he'd said. "A woman like you don't deserve a second chance." But she hadn't lied. Not about the baby. Not about her past. Only about her hope. Now alone and breathless, she pushed forward because it was all she knew how to do. Somewhere in the storm, a shape rose out of the white, low and wide like a crouching beast. A barn, unpainted, unswept by tracks, tucked behind a cluster of bare cottonwoods that rattled in the wind like bones. She squinted. Was it real? Her knees gave out just as she reached the doors. She didn't remember falling, only the sudden rush of cold hay against her palms, and then the slow crawl forward, hand over hand, as if dragging herself across the ruins of a war she never asked to fight. Inside was warmer, barely. The walls groaned under the weight of snow, but there was straw and a rusted lantern half filled with oil. She pulled the doors closed behind her, bracing them with her back until the wind became only a whisper. She wrapped herself in the remains of a horse blanket and collapsed near a mound of hay. There in the half-dark, she cried, not loud, but with that hollow, shaking breath only the forgotten know. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering, "I'm still here," as if to promise the child she wouldn't let go. The barn creaked. Somewhere above, wind slipped through the slats like fingers through hair. The baby kicked softly. Bellstar smiled, tears drying against her cheeks like frost. Then came the sound of boots. She sat upright. Her breath caught. A shadow crossed the doorway, tall and silent. The man stepped inside with a rifle in one hand and a flurry of snow clinging to his coat. He didn't speak, just studied her. This strange woman curled in his barn, belly round beneath her patched coat, eyes wide and hollowed. His jaw was rough with stubble, his coat patched like hers, and sorrow lived behind his eyes like an old tenant. "I'll go," Bellstar rasped, trying to rise. Pain lanced through her side. Just needed shelter. The man didn't move. His eyes flicked to her belly, then back to her face. She waited for him to speak, to curse her, to drag her out by her collar. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, set the rifle down, and unwrapped a burlap sack from his shoulder. Bread, hard but fresh, a jar of beans, a tin cup, and a jug of water. He knelt and placed them beside her without a word. Bellstar blinked. Her voice cracked. "Why?" He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw it. Not pity, not judgment, just tiredness. And something else. A flicker of recognition, maybe of knowing. "Name's Elias Boone," he said at last, voice rough like gravel dragged through silence. She nodded, too stunned to answer. He stood again, motioned to the loft above. "There's quilts. Ain't much, but it's warmer." Then he turned and walked back into the storm. She didn't ask why, didn't call after him. She only stared at the door long after he was gone, as snow piled higher against the frame. That night, Bellstar curled beneath a faded quilt that smelled of cedar and ash. The lantern flickered beside her. Her fingers trembled as she opened her mama's journal, tracing the words she'd memorized 100 times. "You are not what they call you. You are not what they leave behind. You are what you carry forward." Outside, the snowstorm howled like a creature mourning its own loneliness. But inside that barn, for the first time in weeks, Bellstar slept. She dreamed not of Harold Graves or the town that named her harlot before asking her side. She dreamed of a porch bathed in dawn light, of a child with her mama's eyes, and a man sitting quietly nearby. No savior, just a presence. Solid, still, waiting. When she woke, the wind had quieted. Her hands were warm beneath the quilt. The bread Elias had left sat on a plate near the fire, steam rising from its crust. And in that silence, she understood something. Maybe survival wasn't always loud. Maybe it was choosing to keep breathing, even when no one watched. Maybe it was saying, "I am still here, even when the world wished you weren't." She sat up slowly, hand resting on her stomach. "Still here," she whispered again. And this time, it felt like a promise. The first thaw didn't come from the sun, but from routine. Bellstar rose each day with the cold still biting at her knuckles. She swept the barn before sunrise, milked the one goat Elias kept, and hauled water with slow determination, though her breath trembled with each step. Her belly grew heavier by the week, and so did the silence between her and the man who had taken her in. He never asked questions, never crossed lines. He left food on the wooden crate outside the barn and firewood stacked neatly by the door. He spoke only when necessary and watched her with a kind of distant grief, like a man who'd buried too much to believe in spring. In town, the talk had started. At the trading post, Bellstar kept her head down and her voice quiet as she handed over jars of berry preserves she'd learned to make from her mama's notes. The woman behind the counter raised one brow, without looking up. "Boone's barn girl, ain't you?" she said, dry as kindling. Bellstar nodded. The woman didn't take the jars, just pushed them back. "We don't deal in pity, sweetheart." Bellstar walked home without speaking, her boots slipping on the frozen path, hands raw from holding her pride too tightly. That night, she chopped vegetables for stew with fingers wrapped in cloth. Her stomach ached. The baby shifted, and still, she kept stirring. One afternoon, while hanging linens Elias had given her to wash, a soft voice spoke behind her. "You stitched that shawl yourself?" Bellstar turned. A girl stood at the fence, no more than 10, with freckles dusting her nose and hair in 2 uneven braids. Her boots were too big, her eyes too steady. "Yes," Bellstar replied, watching her. The girl stepped forward, snow crunching underfoot. She wore no coat. Bellstar gestured. "You'll freeze out here." "I don't mind." The girl hesitated. "Uncle Elias sent me. Said you might be lonely." Bellstar blinked. "You're his niece." The girl nodded. "Hattie, my mama's gone." Bellstar knelt slowly, one hand on her knee. "Mine too." They stood in silence. Then Hattie reached in her pocket and pulled out a folded book. "You can borrow this, if you like stories." Bellstar took it gently. "Thank you." From that day forward, Hattie returned every few afternoons. She never stayed long. Sometimes she brought slices of apple, wrapped in cloth, or dried corn cakes. Sometimes she simply sat beside Bellstar while she mended seams, the only sound between them the wind scraping against the walls. Elias said little, but Bellstar noticed small changes. A nail hammered into the barn wall to hang her shawl, a fresh set of mittens folded beside her quilt, a second lantern with full oil. She tried to return the kindness. She baked sweet cornbread, burned the first 3 batches, and left the 4th near his porch. He didn't speak of it, but the tin came back empty. At the well one morning, her strength gave out. The bucket was half full when her knees buckled. Her body sagged forward. Cold flooded her lungs like a curse. She tried to push up, her palms slipping against ice, but the world blurred and tilted. Her vision tunneled. Then boots. Strong arms lifting her, rough fabric against her cheek. "You're pushing too hard," Elias murmured, voice low with worry. She wanted to answer, but all she managed was a single word. "Sorry." He carried her back, wrapped her in blankets, and lit the stove with hands that trembled more than hers. Where her breath steadied and her eyes opened, he sat across from her, elbows on his knees, eyes on the fire. "I didn't take you in out of charity," he said, finally. "I did it because no soul deserves to freeze alone." Bellstar's throat closed. "Even one with stories?" He looked at her then. "We've all got stories. Doesn't mean we get to throw each other away." She turned her face to the fire and let the warmth settle deep into her ribs. She didn't cry. Not then. In town, the whispers didn't stop, but they softened. One elderly man accepted her pies. A widow praised her stitching, though never in public. And once, a child she didn't recognize waved at her before darting behind a fence. She wasn't welcome, but she wasn't invisible either. Elias never asked about the father, never asked about where she came from or why she'd been out in that storm. He didn't flinch when she told him, quietly, that Harold had promised her marriage and broke it the day she told him about the baby. "Reckon that says more about him than you," was all he said. She sewed a patch on his shirt one night and left it folded on his porch. The next day, he wore it to chop wood without comment. She began humming while she worked, just softly. The snow didn't stop, but it didn't bite quite so hard. One evening, as she peeled potatoes inside the barn, Hattie asked, "Are you staying?" Bellstar glanced up. "I don't know," she said. "I never meant to." Hattie shrugged. "You fit." "Fit." The girl nodded. "Uncle Elias don't look so sad anymore." Bellstar looked away. Maybe it's just the stew. But she knew it wasn't. She still had nightmares of Harold's voice, of being turned out again, of the baby arriving too soon with no one around. But now when she woke, there was firelight, a blanket, and sometimes a slice of bread left beside her lantern with a single word on a scrap of paper: "Eat." The shame still lived in her bones, but it didn't rule her anymore. She began carving spoons from discarded wood, little ones, for babies, for the child that stirred each night in her belly with quiet kicks. The first time Elias saw them, he picked one up, turned it in his hand, and said, "You're building something." Bellstar looked at the spoon. "I'm trying." "Then keep going." She didn't smile, but her heart did. The wind howled outside that night, but it felt further away than usual. In the barn loft, beneath a quilt, now patched with bright colors, Bellstar lay with one hand resting on her belly and the other on the journal her mama once filled with hope. She read the last page again. "If they strip your name, wear grace like armor. If they steal your voice, let your hands sing instead. If they call you less, build more. And if you're cast out, make your own home anyway. She closed the book and whispered, I am. And this time she believed it. The days lengthened, though the snow showed no signs of retreat. In the hush between storms, something new began to grow, quieter than hope, steadier than kindness. Belle Star stopped counting how long she had been in Elias Boone's barn. Time had softened into rhythm. She rose with the frost, fed the goat, swept the straw, mended shirts that weren't hers, and read beside a fire she no longer feared would go out. Her body was heavy now, the child within pressing against her ribs like a gentle reminder of what she carried. But her heart no longer sagged under the weight of being unwanted. She still heard the whispers in town when she passed through, still saw the sidelong glances, the way men averted their eyes and women pinched their lips. But they rolled off her now like sleet off oilcloth. She had endured worse. She had survived worse. And she had work to do. Elias never asked for anything in return. But he didn't have to. One morning, Belle found a folded shirt on the bench outside his cabin with a tear at the sleeve. No note, no expectation, just an unspoken offering. She stitched it while the fire crackled. When she returned it, folded with care, there was a fresh pair of wool socks resting on the bench the next morning. So it went. He fixed a broken hinge on the barn door without her asking. She cleaned the rust from his coffee pot. He left a small tin of salve when her hands chapped from the cold. She mended the quilt that had frayed at the corners. They spoke little, but they listened loud, with actions, not words. One evening, as the snow tapped softly against the window panes, Elias knocked on the barn side door, not out of necessity, but invitation. Figured you might want a seat by a real fire, he said. She followed him to the cabin. It smelled of pine wood, tobacco, and something roasted slow in the hearth. He'd cleared the table, set 2 chairs, and laid out cornbread, salted pork, and potatoes mashed with butter. She hesitated, then sat. The meal passed in a silence, so comfortable it almost spoke for them. Belle noticed how he used both hands to pass the bowl, how he waited before speaking, how his eyes flicked to her swollen belly not with fear, but something closer to reverence. You've built a world in there, he murmured, almost to himself. She blinked. What? He nodded at her stomach. You carry something the rest of us can't imagine, and you do it like it's not breaking you. Belle looked down at her hands. Some days it is. Elias leaned back, gaze steady. And still you carry it. She felt something shift then, like the earth tilting just enough for the river to change course. The next morning, a book sat on the crate by her door. The Widow's Almanac, 1877. The inside cover had a faded inscription, for the woman strong enough to start over. Belle ran her fingers over the ink. She opened the first page and began to read aloud to the child within her. Elias started coming by more often, not to check, not to manage, but just to be nearby. He brought nails to repair the loft ladder, helped her lift a bale of hay without comment, sat outside the barn while she worked, carving quiet pieces of wood into shapes neither of them named. One day, he handed her a small carving, a tiny cradle no longer than her palm. For the little one, he said. Her breath caught. You made this. He nodded. She traced it with reverent fingers. Thank you. Elias looked down. I wasn't much good at holding things together before. Figured I'd try now. She wanted to ask. About his past. About the sorrow behind his silence. But she didn't. She knew, too, well, how pain lived in the spaces between words. Instead, she placed the cradle on her bedside crate, beside the lantern and the journal. That night, the baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp. She laughed, pressing a hand to her stomach. Easy, she whispered. We're safe here. The snow began to thaw in April. Not by much, but enough to reveal patches of brown earth beneath the trees. Icicles cracked and fell from the roof in the afternoon sun. Birds returned with tentative chirps. Belle hung linens in the wind, her cheeks flushed pink from a breeze. Hattie skipped nearby, tracing paths in the snow melt with a stick. Uncle says you've made this place look like someone lives here again, the girl said, twirling. Belle smiled. Feels like I do. Did you know my mama used to sing when she was baking? Belle turned. No, I didn't. You hum too, Hattie said. It makes the barn less lonely. Bellstar nodded. I think it's just the wind inside me finding its way out. That evening, Elias knocked again. This time, he didn't bring food. I'm headed into town tomorrow, he said. You need anything? Bellstar hesitated. Maybe a spool of thread. White if they have it. He nodded. Anything else? She opened her mouth, closed it, then said no. He lingered, then added, You've got a good way of filling the quiet. She tilted her head. I thought you liked the quiet. I do, he said, but I like yours better. He turned before she could respond. She watched him walk back through the pale dusk, his coat flaring slightly in the breeze. The next day, he returned with a thread and a shawl, soft blue wool, wrapped gently in brown paper. Bellstar stared at it. This isn't thread. He shrugged. Look cold. Her voice almost failed her. It's beautiful. He looked down. So are you. She didn't answer. But that night, as she folded the shawl over her shoulders and looked at herself in the mirror Elias had hung on the barn wall last week, she saw what he meant. Not beauty like a painting or a jewel, but a kind of stillness, a dignity that had grown root deep. She was not the same woman who had collapsed here months ago. That woman had been running. This one had stayed. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped over the ridge, Elias helped her into the wagon for the first time since she'd arrived. Where are we going? She asked, eyes wary. Just down by the stream. I want to show you something. The snow was mostly gone now, leaving behind soft mud and shoots of green grass. The trees stood bare but expectant, like they too were holding their breath for spring. He stopped the wagon by a small grove and helped her down carefully. The wind tugged at her shawl. She held it close. He pointed to the ridge where a patch of wild crocus bloomed in defiance of the cold. Purple and proud. They bloom here first, he said, before the rest of the land remembers how. Bellstar stared, breath caught. Elias looked at her. You're like that, I think. Came early. Bloomed anyway. She turned to him, heart thick in her chest. He didn't step forward, didn't touch her, but his voice was low, certain. I ain't a skin for anything. I just needed to say it. She stepped forward anyway, rested her hand on his. Thank you, she said, voice trembling. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just watching the flowers shake in the breeze, the sun dipping like honey behind the hills. On the way back, he offered his hand as she climbed into the wagon. She took it, firm and warm, and when they reached the barn, he paused at the steps. Bellstar. She turned. If you ever feel like staying, for good. Her breath caught. I'm not going anywhere, she said. That night, the baby kicked so strong it made her wince. She placed both hands over her belly and smiled into the dark. We're not alone anymore. In the quiet of the barn, beside the cradle carved from pine and the shawl folded like a prayer, Bellstar fell asleep to the sound of her own heartbeat and the memory of a man who finally saw her. Not despite what she carried, but because of it. The snow had given up at last. The world was wet with thaw, the ground breathing again after months beneath silence. Crocuses spilled violet over the hillsides. Children in muddied boots chased geese past fence posts. Doors that had stayed closed all winter cracked open just wide enough to let spring in. And with it came the gathering. They called it the Renewal Social, some mix between a dance and a prayer meeting, where neighbors dusted off grievances and hopes alike. It was held in the wooden hall near the church, where windows opened for the first time in months, and the old piano was tuned just enough to carry a tune. Bellstar hadn't planned to go. Her belly was high now, her steps slower. She couldn't fasten most of her old dresses without a tug of frustration. The idea of facing the same townsfolk who once turned their backs made her chest tight. But Hattie appeared at the barn door one morning, breathless and certain. You have to come. Bellstar glanced up from the loaf she was kneading. Why? Because you're part of us now, Hattie said, as if it were obvious. And everyone's going, even Uncle Elias. Bellstar arched a brow. He is. Hattie nodded. He said it's time. That night, she pulled out the patched blue dress she'd mended week after week, but never dared wear. It didn't fit quite right, not with her belly rounding forward like a sunrise, but she fastened it as best she could and wrapped Elias's shawl tight over her shoulders. The candlelight from the town hall flickered in the distance as she and Elias walked the road together. He didn't offer an arm. He waited. When she stumbled once, he steadied her. That was all. Inside, the hall smelled of cider and floor wax. Lanterns hung from exposed beams. A fiddle called out from the corner, and boots shuffled in answer. Laughter lifted and echoed like birds returning to an old tree. Conversations dimmed when they entered. Bellstar could feel it, the shift. Eyes turned. Whispers stirred. But none of it reached her skin the way it used to. She held her chin steady, her breath slow. One woman nodded politely. Another gave a tight-lipped smile. A few turned away, but no one said what they once might have. She took a seat near the wall. Elias vanished toward the drink table, offering her space without demand. Hattie flitted past with a ribbon in her hair, offering Bellstar a wink that made her laugh under her breath. Across the room, an older woman approached, a widow, known for sewing funeral shawls and scowling at anything joyous. She eyed Bellstar's belly, then her hands, then her boots. "You're the one who fixed my grandson's quilt," she said at last. Bellstar blinked. "Yes, ma'am." The woman grunted. "Good stitch work. Never unraveled." Then she turned and walked away. It was the first compliment Bellstar had heard aloud in town. One by one, small gestures bloomed. A man asked about the goat's milk. A girl said thank you for the mended sleeve. The woman from the post who once refused Bellstar's pies now asked if she still baked with cinnamon. Bellstar answered each with steady grace. And then the music shifted. The fiddle dipped into something slower. A reel faded into a waltz. The hall hushed just enough for her to hear the creak of Elias's boots as he crossed the floor toward her. He didn't offer a hand, not right away. Just stood before her, eyes gentle, voice quiet. "May I?" She looked at her belly. "I don't waltz too light these days." "I don't mind." He held out his hand, palm open like a vow. She took it. They moved slowly. Not a dancer's grace, but something better. A rhythm forged in firewood and shared silence, in stitched sleeves and shawls that carried stories. The music wrapped around them like ribbon. Her hand rested on his shoulder. His stayed respectfully at her waist, not possessive but reverent. People watched, but they didn't whisper. At one point, Elias leaned close and said, "I've waited a long time to see you this way." She looked up. "Dancing?" He smiled, lit from within. Her throat closed with emotion. "Why me?" "Because you stayed." And there it was. Her redemption not from sin, but from silence. Not from shame, but from erasure. When the song ended, he didn't let go right away. The applause was polite. Hattie clapped loudest of all. Elias turned to the crowd. "I've got something to say," he announced. Bellstar tensed. The room quieted. Elias glanced around. "This woman here, she came to my door with nothing but a belly full of courage and a name this town didn't bother learning. I'm a skin you now to learn it." He turned to Bellstar. Bellstar. Her name rang like gospel. He knelt, one knee to the floorboards. Gasps scattered like dandelion fluff. "I know the world tried to turn its back on you. I know you've carried your story alone. But I see it. I see you. And I'd be honored to stand beside you from now till we're both dust." Bellstar's hands flew to her mouth. He didn't offer a ring. Only a hand. No shame. No saving. Just standing. The silence that followed held weight. Then, slowly a clap. Then another. The room rippled with applause not loud, but genuine. Bellstar took his hand and raised him to his feet. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I did," he said. "For me." They didn't kiss. Not yet. But their foreheads touched, and it said more than any vow. Later that night, when the fire burned low and the hall was emptying, Bellstar stepped outside to breathe. The air was brisk, but not cruel. A woman followed her out, a stranger. Dark braid, fur-lined cloak, baby in her arms. "I watch you tonight," she said softly. "We came west for the same reason, I think." Bellstar turned. "What reason is that?" "To disappear, or to be found. I'm still deciding." Bellstar offered a faint smile. "Maybe both can happen." The woman nodded. "Thank you for standing tall. You reminded me." Bellstar watched her go, moonlight catching on her braid like silver thread. She returned to the barn with Elias and Hattie. No one spoke on the walk back, but the silence was warm. Inside, the cradle sat near the stove now. Elias had moved it himself. Bellstar folded her shawl and sat beside it, one hand on her belly, the other on the edge of the pine wood. "You all right?" Elias asked from the door. She nodded. "I think I finally am." And in the hush of that spring night, while snow melted in soft trickles and the world exhaled from its long slumber, Bellstar felt seen, not for what she'd suffered, but for what she had become. The storm came back one final time. It began with a shift in the wind. No howl, just a slow roll over the ridge, heavy and purposeful. Elias noticed it first. He stepped out onto the porch that evening with his coffee in hand, scanned the gray sky, and muttered under his breath, "She's coming hard." Bellstar felt it in her back, a pressure that hadn't been there the night before, a pull low in her belly. The baby, quiet for days, moved with intention now, like a passenger who knew the tracks were running out. They brought her into the cabin. The barn, Elias insisted, had seen enough of her pain. He'd built a space near the hearth weeks ago, a crib, sturdy and simple, lined with quilts stitched from both their hands, a cradle beside a rocking chair, a basin, a kettle, a box of soft cloths. He didn't speak much as he prepared it all, just worked, wood to wood, nail to nail. But she felt the reverence in every stroke. Now, with snow curling against the windows again and the fire casting orange shadows on the walls, Bellstar gripped the edge of the bed frame and breathed. "It's early," she whispered, sweat breaking along her brow. Elias knelt beside her. "We're ready." She shook her head. "You aren't a midwife." "No," he said gently, "but I'm here." Hours passed in rhythms older than language. Breath, push, cry, pause. Hattie fetched towels and water, face pale but steady. Elias held her hand when the pain curled her toes and made her scream into the wooden beams. When she begged for it to stop, he whispered, "You're stronger than the storm." And she was. Sometime just before dawn, the world cracked open. The baby came with a cry fierce enough to silence the snow itself. A boy, squirming in red, fists clenched in fury, as if demanding to know why he'd been asked to wait so long. Bellstar sobbed, laughed, reached for him. Elias placed the child in her arms with hands that had once dug graves and now cradled miracles. She kissed the boy's forehead. "Hello, little one." Elias sat beside her, quiet, gaze wet. "We'll name him Samuel," she said. "Samuel Boone Jenkins." He nodded. Strong name. She rested her head on his shoulder. The baby nuzzled her chest, fists relaxing. Outside, the wind calmed. By the time the sun lifted its face over the horizon, the world had changed. The storm broke. The snow began to melt in earnest. Ice dripped from the eaves in slow, clear rhythm. The sky wore a soft pink veil. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed low. Bellstar dozed with Samuel on her chest. Elias watched them both like a man watching spring for the first time in years. When she stirred, she looked at him fully. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. He tilted his head. "Do you want me to go?" "No," she said. "I just needed to know that you had the choice. I chose you the day you walked into that barn." She closed her eyes. "You didn't even know me then." "I knew enough. I saw someone who hadn't stopped walking." She reached for his hand. "I see you too, Elias. Not for what you've lost, but for what you've built since." He didn't answer. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently, reverently, as one might kiss a folded prayer before setting on the wind. The days that followed were quiet and full. Hattie sang to Samuel when she thought no one listened. Bellstar wrote in her mama's journal each night. Elias carved another cradle, just in case the future held more than one miracle. They didn't rush. They didn't boast. But they belonged. And the town, once filled with whispers, slowly shifted too. Neighbors brought cloth and stew. A young boy built a snowman outside their cabin and waved through the window. Someone left a jar of honey with a note that said, "Welcome, little one." Bellstar didn't need their approval, but she let in all the same. One Sunday morning, Elias stood beside her as the Reverend asked the congregation to bless the child. Bellstar held Samuel in her arms. Not a single person looked away. And afterward, as they walked home across the softening earth, Elias looked at her and said, "You know they talk about you now." "I'm sure they do." "No, not like before. They talk about your strength, about how you never bowed." Bellstar smiled. Then they finally see the truth. They reached the barn door, the place it had all begun. She paused, looked at it fully. The wood had been patched, the roof rethatched. It was no longer a place of collapse. It was the beginning of everything. That night, Bellstar stood at the window with Samuel in her arms. The stars blinked above the hills. Elias slept nearby, arm draped protectively over the blanket. The baby made a small sound, nestled into her neck. She rocked gently, and then she turned, just slightly, as if speaking to someone beyond the walls. So if the world ever tells you that you're too ruined to begin again, remember Bellstar. Remember the girl who was turned out in a snowstorm with only a belly full of courage and a name nobody cared to ask. Remember that she didn't vanish. She stayed. She stitched her worth back together thread by thread. She baked bread when she had no words. She built a home in the same place she once bled. And when the time came, she didn't ask to be saved. She let herself be seen. So if you ever find yourself broken or left behind or waiting in the cold, know that you are one sunrise away from beginning again. Just one, and the dawn always comes.